Today on the Perception in Action podcast, a look at some different ways we can cue and provide feedback to a performer, including bandwidth, temporal-comparative and translational feedback, and rhythm-based cueing. So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I want to consider some different ways we might provide feedback and cue an athlete that are different than the traditional methods most coaches use. As I've discussed a lot on the podcast, there are limitations with using traditional knowledge of results outcome feedback and verbal cueing. So maybe we can aid skill acquisition by turning to some alternatives. Let's have a look. Let's start with feedback. The different types of feedback is something that I first discussed way back in episode 18. To refresh your memory, we can categorize feedback along two dimensions. Intrinsic feedback is information we get from our own senses, like feeling the vibration of a bat in our hands or seeing a ball travel onto a field. While extrinsic feedback is something that we get from the outside, like reading off a device measuring the exit speed of a ball, or a coach giving us verbal feedback. Another way to think of it is, extrinsic feedback augments our own naturally available intrinsic feedback. Knowledge of performance feedback, or KP feedback, refers to information about the execution of the movement itself. Things like you didn't keep your elbow in on that swing. While knowledge of results, or KR feedback, refers to the outcome of the movement. In general, a lot of what we focus on in coaching and skill acquisition tends to be extrinsic knowledge of results feedback because that's what we have control over. Along these lines, one of the most consistent research findings we see in the area is that too much of this type of feedback, or giving it at the wrong time, can be bad. Listen back to episode 12 for some studies that have shown this. In terms of frequency, giving extrinsic KR feedback after every trial has shown to significantly impair skill acquisition relative to giving it on 50% of the trials or even less. This is thought to occur for a couple different reasons. First, it has been proposed that giving too much extrinsic feedback decreases sensitivity or decreases attention to, leading to a performer ignoring intrinsic feedback, which is bad because intrinsic is what the athlete will have to rely on in competition. A second problem with giving extrinsic KR feedback after every execution is that it will not take into account the magnitude of the performance errors an athlete is making. That is, even if they make a very tiny error, they're going to get feedback telling them something is wrong with the movement. This tends to lead to a tendency to overcorrect skill execution. Turning to the timing of feedback, research has shown that if the time interval between the execution of the movement and the feedback is too short, it will not give sufficient time for learners to process the information provided from the feedback, inhibiting their ability to detect errors and change movement patterns. Timing also seems to affect the way in which a skill is learned, with short interval feedback leading to more implicit learning and longer delayed feedback leading to more explicit. For Patreon supporters, I discussed this issue in the February 2018 bonus episode. Focusing on the problem of too much extrinsic KR feedback, how then is a coach supposed to deal with this issue? Don't give feedback after every execution leaves open a lot of other possibilities. One is to use summary feedback, where you give the average of some KR outcome after 5 or 10 executions. But this can have its limitations, as discussed in episode 132 when looking at simple versus complex skills, because it can be difficult, especially for a more novice performer, to link specific movement patterns to specific results when they're only getting a summary. A second alternative I want to talk about today is bandwidth feedback. To illustrate this, imagine we're coaching a baseball pitcher to throw a new type of pitch. To keep the pitch separate from their other pitches they throw and make it more difficult for a hitter to adjust, we want them to throw this pitch at a specific speed, 80 miles per hour. We have a radar gun which measures the speed and we can use to give extrinsic KR feedback. Obviously, we want to avoid showing pitch speed on every pitch, so what do? To use bandwidth feedback, we first define a bandwidth of performance outcomes around our target. I will talk about the choice of the value in a second, but a common one that has been used in a lot of research is 5%. So for my pitching example, an 80 mile per hour target with a value of 5% would give a bandwidth of 76 to 84 miles per hour. That is plus or minus the bandwidth value. Once we have established this bandwidth, we next follow a very simple rule during practice. If the performance outcome, in this case pitch speed, falls within the bandwidth, we do not give any feedback at all or just give qualitative verbal feedback, things like good job. We do this because performers are told before practice that if the outcome falls in a range, then the action has been performed correctly. The purpose of the qualitative feedback is primarily motivational. If the outcome of the action falls outside the bandwidth, then we provide the quantitative KR feedback, i.e. the pitch speed from the radar gun. In theory, this is going to be better because it will lead to a lower frequency of feedback and prevent overcorrection. It also has the advantage over summary feedback or just arbitrarily reducing feedback frequency because it gives the performer the information when they maybe need it the most. That is when they have a large error and need the most assistance. But what does the research actually show us about this? The first study of bandwidth feedback was by David Sherwood in 1988. In this study, participants were asked to perform a rapid elbow flexion movement, in which they had to slide a lever along a 60-inch track within 200 milliseconds. 3 groups were compared: a group that received feedback about their movement time on every trial, a group with a 5% bandwidth around the 200 millisecond goal, and a group with a 10% bandwidth. What was found? As predicted, both bandwidth groups learned the task better, as assessed in retention and transfer conditions, than the group that received feedback on every trial, that is a 0% bandwidth. But surprisingly, the 10% bandwidth group did the best, significantly outperforming the 5% group in terms of variable error. This suggests that extrinsic KR feedback with a relatively large bandwidth may be the best for motor learning. A similar study using a sports task was conducted by Smith and colleagues in 1997. The authors of this study also addressed another problem with KR feedback. Specifically, for most complex tasks, it might not provide enough information to allow a performer to adapt their movement solution. If we think about it, in most tasks that have been used to study feedback in the lab, there is an isomorphic relationship between feedback and error correction. For example, in a finger press force task, if I show you that you applied too much force, the correction is obvious. Push a little bit lighter with your finger next time. This was obviously the case for the Sherwood study I just described as well. But for more complex tasks we see in sports, where many body parts must move in a coordinated fashion, this isomorphic relationship between feedback and correction is not likely to hold. For example, in my pitching training I described a few moments ago, if the pitcher throws the ball too slow, should they change this on the next pitch by using more leg force, more hip rotation, greater arm speed, etc.? The problem, as Smith and colleagues describe it, is that extrinsic KR feedback is not specific enough in that it does not tell the performer what they need to do to correct their performance error. To address this issue, the authors of this study introduced the concept of translational feedback, which is sort of a combo of KR and KP. Translational feedback is designed to direct a performer's attention to the aspect of the movement pattern that needs to be changed or corrected to address the performance errors they're making. This is typically done through the use of verbal cues. So it's essentially using the results and the performance together. To investigate this type of feedback, Smith and colleagues used a task in which 48 participants were asked to chip a golf ball so that it landed on a target line 10 meters away. A visor was used so that they could not see where the ball landed, thus KR feedback could be controlled. 6 different training groups were compared, with 8 participants per group. Groups were all possible combinations of 3 different KR bandwidths, 0, 5, and 10%, and 2 types of feedback, regular KR or translational. KR feedback involves showing participants how far off the target line the ball landed in centimeters. The 0% groups received this on every trial, while the 5 or 10% bandwidth groups received it only when it fell outside their calculated bandwidths. All groups were told that when they received no feedback, it meant the ball landed very close to the line. Participants in the translational feedback group received no information about how far off the line the ball landed, but instead were given a verbal cue, which was derived from a coach's recommendation. Cues were targeted at one of the subcomponents of the swing, the setup, the backswing, impact, or follow-through. It's important to emphasize here that these verbal cues again followed the bandwidth rules. That is, they were only given when the outcome fell outside the range for each group. What was found? The main overall effect found in this study was that the 10% bandwidth translational feedback group performed significantly better than the other groups at retention. This was assessed in terms of variable error. The authors argue that this occurred because this group received feedback that both guided them towards an appropriate movement solution and avoided the pitfalls of overcorrection and desensitization to intrinsic feedback. The other type of feedback I wanted to mention today is more focused on motivational functions of feedback than the informational ones I've been talking about. Specifically, previous research has shown that temporal-comparative feedback, which compares and contrasts the performance outcomes of the same performer across practice trials or sessions, can play an important motivational role by promoting a greater sense of competence. To investigate whether this type of feedback aids motor learning, Chiviakowski and colleagues recently conducted a golf putting study in which two groups were compared. The positive temporal comparative feedback group received feedback suggesting that their average performance, or their putting error, in a given block of trials was better than their average performance in the previous block. Specifically, they were told their performance was around 10, 15, 15, and 20% better after the second, third, fourth, and fifth blocks of trials, respectively. Note, this was false feedback, as it was given whether or not performance actually improved by this much or not. The control group did not receive any temporal comparative feedback at all. All groups, of course, received intrinsic KR feedback after every trial as they could see where the ball ended up. So the temporal comparative feedback is augmenting the intrinsic feedback. There were 14 participants that were unexperienced golfers per group. What was found? There were no significant group differences during acquisition, but the temporal comparative group performed significantly better than the control group during a retention test. The authors argue that this feedback creates a higher success experience during practice, providing greater motivation for learners to continue to improve. For me, I would question how this false feedback relates to what is actually occurring. One would think that with experience, performers would quickly learn that the temporal comparative feedback is not matching what they're actually experiencing, such that this type of feedback may only work for complete novices. Turning to cueing, I want to look at a couple articles that discuss an interesting alternative to the type of verbal cues that are commonly used in coaching, specifically rhythm cueing. The first is a kind of position piece and review published by McPherson and colleagues in 2009. In this article, rhythm is defined as a temporal pattern apparent in movement whose constituent parts are relatively stable. Another way to think of this is in terms of relative timing. Let me give you an example from some work I've done on baseball swings. If we look at a baseball swing, it has a set of component parts. For example, the wind-up, where the batter lifts their lead foot off the ground and puts it back down, the pre-swing, where the body is coiled away from the ball, the swing, the follow-through, etc. We can measure the time each of these components takes. For example, the wind-up might last 300 milliseconds. The amount of time of each component and the total duration of the swing refers to absolute time. When we look at several swings made by the same batter, even a highly experienced one, the absolute timing can vary quite substantially. What is more consistent from swing to swing in expert batters is the relative timing. That is, the proportion of the total swing time taken up by each component. So, for example, even if the total absolute time of the swing might change, the wind-up typically takes up roughly a quarter of that time. So, just like a piece of music, a skilled swing has a rhythm. Even though we can stretch out the duration of a note in a song, a half note will always last half the duration of a whole note. That is, absolute timing might change, but relative timing is preserved. In a 2004 study, I found that for batters that struggle under pressure, it is this relative timing that breaks down. So, stated another way, the absence of rhythm, or relative timing, means that there are temporal irregularities in the movement pattern, and this is a characteristic of inefficient or suboptimal movement. Another example of this can be seen in a study of free throw shooting by Southard and Miracle published in 1993. In this study, shooters were required to alter either the absolute or relative timing of their pre-shot routine. Results indicated that consistent rhythm of performance rituals was more important to successful shot outcome than maintaining the absolute time taken. On the basis of this pre-performance evidence, it appears that successful movement execution requires that the ratio of the movement components be in synchrony. Quote from the authors, we interpret the timing of behaviors to be a natural manifestation of rhythmic activity in the system." Unquote. Another reason that rhythm can be important is from the perspective of metabolic efficiency. Previous research has shown that individuals have their own preferred cadence or pace, and when allowed to perform at this pace, for example when walking or running, their movements require less effort. Conversely, when a particular stride rate or cadence is imposed on an individual, oxygen consumption rises significantly. A final example I will give for the importance of rhythms are attractors for coordination, which I discussed back in episode 88. In that episode, I explained how there's a natural attractor when we drum our fingers for in-phase movement. That is, our fingers hitting the table at the same time. There is also a slightly weaker attractor for completely 180 degrees out of phase movement. So, you can think of the perceptual motor landscape as having preferred rhythms for movement as expressed in the form of phase attractors. In their article, McPherson and colleagues argue that understanding the rhythm and temporal properties of movements and how these vary as a function of movement success can provide meaningful insight into the processes underlying successful motor task performance. They also propose that developing cues aimed at movement rhythm might be an effective way to refine movement patterns without overly invoking conscious control in a skilled performer. That is, providing athletes with a holistic rhythmical or temporal guide that emphasizes the timing of the whole skill rather than dissecting components of the skill into parts. McPherson and colleagues also argue that using cue words that have little rhythmical sense or feeling concerning the skill itself can be inefficient because they require the athlete to divert cognitive resources to translate this information into a motor code. Quoting from the article, "Words are at least 2 steps removed from the perception and action that you actually experience. When you think of a word, it has meaning only because you can relate the sound or group of letters to something you know through perception or experience." End quote. Stated another way, the use of rhythm cues has the potential to communicate with the body using its own language. A final point before giving some specific examples of the use of rhythm cues in action. There are several reasons to expect that using sound-based rhythms will be more effective than ones in other modalities. Auditory cues can hold much more information than visual cues, particularly in terms of the temporal structure. It has also been shown that our ability to synchronize with a cue is far more accurate for audition as compared to vision. The first published example of this type of rhythm cueing was in 2002. The aqua pacer was successfully used to develop rhythmical sense in swimmers that allowed them to alter their pace more effectively, rather than relying on their own judgments using a poolside clock. A more recent example of this is the baseball swing cueing system developed by Onishi and colleagues and described in an article published earlier this year. In this article, the authors begin by discussing the importance of relative timing for establishing an effective kinetic chain in the movement. In a baseball swing, as well as other movements, the specific relative timing used is not just a preference. It is often that way because it results in an effective transfer of energy and momentum from one component of a movement, for example shoulder rotation, to another, arm swing. So in other words, having and maintaining a good relative timing can ensure an efficient connection between the acceleration in proximal and distal parts of the body, resulting in faster and more powerful movements. The goal of this present study was using auditory rhythm cues to help develop the relative timing and kinetic linking for novice hitters. Supporting this idea, there's lots of research showing that this type of information can be effective for correcting movement after stroke, for example. The cueing system developed in this study, which I've included a diagram of in the show notes, consists of 3 acceleration sensors, one on the waist, bottom of the elbow, and the wrist. When the body starts moving, the system presents an auditory cue related to each of these 3 parts. Thus, a swing with an effective kinetic chain should have a rhythm to it, with the quote-unquote sound of the waist predominating early, followed by the elbow and the wrist. For details on the exact formula used to generate these signals, please see the paper, link in the show notes. Similar to what I've discussed a few moments ago, auditory feedback was chosen for 3 primary reasons. 1, it's been shown to be preferable for motor learning in previous research. I will discuss this more in a future episode. 2, visual and haptic feedback tends to interfere with the swing. And 3, auditory information is optimal for instructing temporal sequence. In the paper, the authors first evaluated skill level differences in an experiment involving 3 skilled batters and 3 beginners. The kinetic link was quantified in terms of a ratio, where a higher value means that the acceleration of one body part is being effectively transferred to another. The skilled players in their study had an average ratio of 96.7%, meaning that these players accelerated in turn the waist, elbow, then the wrist. In contrast, the swing ratio for beginners was only 10%, meaning that they did not have as much control over the sequential body motion as the skilled players did. The final part of the paper describes a training program designed to improve this ratio in the beginners. To quote the description of the procedure, we instructed participants to twist their trunks to start their motion from the waist and move to the elbow in turn. After this instruction, participants listen for the auditory cue sounds while swinging the bat. After this first stage, the beginners repeatedly practice their swing and listen to the auditory cue to develop more automatic body movements. End quote. This study involved 22 novice batters that were split evenly into a cueing and no training control groups. Tests of hitting a ball off a tee were used pre- and post-training. What was found? Compared with the control group, swing speed in the training group increased significantly. In terms of the kinetic chain, in the training group, the post-test maximum acceleration of the elbow and wrist increased significantly compared to pre-test. However, there was no significant differences between the pre-test and post-test in terms of the waist and shoulder maximal accelerations. The authors propose that this lack of effect for these body parts may be due to trunk mobility limitations in the batters. Thus, even though they received effective feedback, they may not have the physical capacity to make the necessary corrections. Again, another reason why there needs to be a strong connection between skill acquisition and strength and conditioning in training. In sum, there's a growing body of evidence that using auditory rhythm cues may be an effective method for cueing movement, both in novices and for more experienced athletes that have had their relative timing disrupted for some reason, for example, due to pressure or injury. And hopefully there'll be more technologies like this swing guide developed to support this in the future. To sum up, in today's episode, we looked at research which has shown that there's several interesting alternatives for cueing and giving feedback to athletes that address some of the documented problems with more traditional methods. I highly encourage coaches to play around with these types and see what works for you. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or on Twitter @ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials including an extra monthly episode and written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled. I hear the winter cut you quick.